Right now, in a room you know well, there is probably something in plain view that you have never once noticed. We like to imagine that vision works like a camera, eyes open, pointed the right way, recording whatever is in front of them. It's a comforting idea, and it's not quite true. Consider a well-known experiment. People watch a short video of others passing a basketball, and they're asked to count the passes. They focus, they keep score. Partway through, a person in a gorilla costume walks into the middle of the scene, stops, faces the camera, and walks off. Afterward, many of the viewers have no idea the gorilla was ever there. They were looking straight at it. They didn't see it. This is called inattentional blindness. When your attention is fully committed to one task, an unexpected object can pass in front of your open eyes and still fail to reach your awareness. The light from that gorilla did reach the retina. What didn't happen was the next step, the moment where the brain flags something as worth noticing. Attention works like a gatekeeper, and when it's busy, the gate can stay shut. You don't need a laboratory to find this. You open the fridge and search for the butter that's sitting right in front of you. You hunt for keys that are in your own hand. You walk straight past a friend on a busy street because your mind was elsewhere. Your eyes were working the whole time. The information arrived. It just never became something you noticed. There's a useful way to picture attention. Think of it less as a wide, even floodlight and more as a spotlight on a dark stage. Whatever falls inside the beam becomes vivid and clear. Everything outside it stays in shadow, present but unattended. Most of the time, you never feel that shadow. The world looks complete, seamless, fully there. It's only in these odd little moments that you notice how much of what's in front of you never quite makes it in. But attention doesn't only shape what you see, it also shapes what you assume other people can see in you. You spill a little coffee on your shirt before a meeting, and for the next hour you're certain everyone can see it. You say something slightly awkward at a party, and you replay it half the night, sure that other people are replaying it too. Here is the surprising part. There's a good chance they aren't. Many of the people around you probably barely registered the stain, and the awkward line may already have slipped their minds. The sense of being closely watched and judged is real as a feeling, but it tends to overshoot the truth. Psychologists call this the spotlight effect. We tend to overestimate how much other people notice our appearance, our mistakes, and our behavior. The reason is clear once you see it. You are the constant center of your own experience. Your stain, your slip, your bad hair day sit right at the front of your attention, so it feels obvious that they must sit at the front of everyone else's. But other people are living inside their own point of view, every bit as absorbed in themselves as you are in you. You can catch it in small moments. You enter a room convinced people are studying your outfit, when in truth most gave it a glance and moved on. You're sure as stumble over your words to find the whole conversation, while the person across from you was busy worrying about their own. Each of us feels like the main character. Everyone else feels the same way, which means the audience you're imagining is mostly other people watching themselves. Underneath this is an imbalance built into perception. You have full, vivid access to your own thoughts and flaws, and only a thin, outside view of everyone else's. That mismatch makes your own visibility feel far larger than it is. The feeling of being watched isn't a lie exactly. It's a byproduct of living behind one particular pair of eyes. There's real relief in that. The mistakes you carry for hours were, for nearly everyone else, a passing detail. And once the pressure of being watched lets up, the mind is free to roam, sometimes so freely that it loses track of what it set out to do. You stand up with a clear purpose. You're going to the kitchen to get something. You know exactly what. You walk in, and it's gone. Not the room, the reason. You stand there, faintly annoyed, waiting for it to come back. This small blank has been studied, and it even has a nickname, the doorway effect. In experiments where people move through a space while trying to hold something in mind, researchers have found that passing through a doorway can make that held thought harder to retrieve, more so than covering the same distance within a single room. The leading explanation is about how the mind organizes experience. We don't store life as one smooth stream. We break it into episodes, and the boundaries between those episodes tend to fall at natural transitions, finishing a task, switching activities, moving from one room to another. When you cross such a boundary, the mind appears to close out the previous segment and open a new one. Anything you were loosely holding for later, like why you got up, can get filed away with the segment you just ended. It's worth being careful here. Several experiments have reported this pattern, but later research suggests it isn't guaranteed. Whether it shows up at all seems to depend a great deal on the design of the task, on how much you're holding in mind, on how distracted you are, and on the surrounding context. Not every doorway costs you a thought. The event boundary idea remains the leading way to explain the effect, rather than a settled mechanism. Doorways aren't magic. They're one common example of a mental boundary. You'll notice the same thing beyond kitchens. You open a new tab to look something up and forget what it was. You walk into another room and have to retrace your steps to where the thought began, and retracing them can sometimes help, possibly because the original surroundings offer cues that jog the memory. So the forgetting isn't a sign of weak memory. It's a side effect of something useful, a mind that cuts a continuous day into manageable chapters so it isn't swamped by one endless stream. The cost is the occasional lost errand. The benefit is a life you can actually keep track of. And sometimes the mind runs the opposite way, taking scattered fragments and insisting on finding a shape. Look at the front of a car for a moment, and you might catch it looking back. Headlight eyes, a grill for a mouth, an expression somewhere between surprised and smug. A power outlet stares, a worn rock scowls. A patch of damp on a ceiling becomes, for a second, a face. This is pareidolia, the tendency to see meaningful forms, especially faces, in random or ambiguous patterns. And of everything we're primed to find, faces come first. Give the eye 2 dots and a line beneath them, roughly placed, and it reads a face almost at once, whether or not one is really there. There's a reason perception leans this way. Faces are among the most important things a person ever has to read, friend or stranger, calm or angry, attending to you or not. A system tuned to spot possible faces quickly will inevitably raise some false alarms, flagging a face where there is none. Catching the occasional face too many is a natural byproduct of a system built to find them fast. It's tempting to pin this on a single spot in the brain, but face perception isn't run by one region acting alone. It draws on a network of areas that handle faces and patterns together, which is part of why the effect is so fast and so hard to override. Even once you know the face on the car is only headlights and metal, you can still see the expression. Knowing better doesn't switch it off. And this is an ordinary feature of perception, not a sign that anything is wrong. It's a common feature of healthy perception, familiar to nearly everyone. It's why clouds turn into animals, why a house can look sad, why people have spotted faces in toast and tree bark for as long as there have been people to look. What it really shows is that perception isn't a plain recording of the world. The mind is always making guesses, filling ambiguous input with its best interpretation. And one of its favorite guesses, over and over, is a face. We're pattern finders by design, reading meaning into noise, now and then seeing company where there is only shape and shadow. That same readiness to seize on a meaningful signal shows up in what we hear. You're at a busy gathering, locked into one conversation, and the rest of the room has blurred into a wash of noise. Then, from somewhere across that noise, you hear your own name. Your head turns before you've decided to turn it. That ordinary moment holds a real puzzle. If you had truly filtered out all the other voices, how did one word get through? This is the cocktail party effect. The ability to focus on a single voice in a sea of competing sound, while still catching certain things from the channels you're ignoring. Start with the focusing, which is impressive on its own. In a room full of overlapping speech, you can lock onto one speaker and follow their words, using the sound of their voice, the direction it comes from, and the thread of meaning to hold the line. The other conversations never stop reaching your ears. Your attention simply keeps them in the background. But that background isn't sealed off. Some monitoring continues out there, enough that a highly relevant signal, like your name or a nearby mention of something you care about, can sometimes break through and pull your focus toward it. It's a sensible design. A filter that let nothing through would leave you deaf to a warning or a call for help. Here's the important limit. This doesn't mean every unattended conversation is fully understood and stored while you're not listening. How much of that other speech gets processed seems to vary, with the task, with the listener, and with how much attention the main conversation is taking. Some things register, a great deal doesn't. What the cocktail party effect shows is that a salient signal can catch you, not that you take in whole conversations you weren't following. What tends to get through is short, personally significant, and hard to miss, which is why your own name is the classic example. You can feel both sides in daily life. You tune out the cafe's background chatter to read, then look up sharply when someone nearby says something oddly close to your own thoughts. Attention works like an adjustable gate rather than a solid wall, mostly closed but ready to open for the right thing. Sometimes, though, the thing you're reaching for is inside your own head, and the gate won't open at all. You're telling a story, and you reach for a name, an actor, a town, an old colleague, and it isn't there. Not gone exactly. You can feel its shape. You know roughly how many syllables it has, maybe the letter it starts with, maybe that it rhymes with something. But the word itself stays just out of reach. This is the tip of the tongue state, and it's one of the clearest windows into how memory actually works. The key insight is that knowing a word and retrieving a word are not the same act. In this moment, you clearly haven't lost the memory. You can sense its edges. What has failed is the last step, pulling the full form up into speech. Memory for words seems to involve more than one layer. There's what a word means and how it links to everything else you know, and there's its exact sound and spelling. Usually, these arrive together instantly. In a tip-of-the-tongue moment, much of what the word means and connects to is still within reach, while its exact sound comes only in pieces. A rhythm, a first letter, a near-miss word that keeps pushing in and getting in the way. It happens more with names and rarely used words, which have fewer connections to haul them up, and more often when you're tired. You'll know the particular frustration. The harder you push, the more stuck it feels. Often, the missing word simply appears later once your attention has moved on to something else. It would be neat to blame one specific glitch, but the honest picture is less tidy. This is a normal, temporary breakdown in a multi-step retrieval process, not a single failure in one place, and not a sign that anything is wrong with your memory. If anything, it's evidence of how much is there. You know so much about the word that its absence is loud. That's the odd paradox of it. The feeling of almost having it is proof of how much you actually hold. And the mind has other loops like this. Ones that don't leave just because you ask them to. You catch a few seconds of a song on the radio in the morning, and hours later, standing in a queue somewhere, the same fragment is still going around in your head. Not the whole song, usually just a hook, a line, a handful of notes, playing on repeat. This is called involuntary musical imagery, though most people know it by a friendlier name, an earworm. A short piece of music replays in your mind on its own, without you choosing to summon it, and often with no easy way to switch it off. The pieces that get stuck don't follow a single formula, but a few features come up again and again. Earworms are often tunes you already know well, familiar, memorable, and repetitive, or carrying a distinctive rise and fall in the melody. Recent exposure plays a part too. A song you heard earlier that day can resurface, and so can a word, a place, or a mood that recalls the tune. Sometimes there's no obvious trigger at all. Why the fragment loops is not fully understood. One popular idea is that the mind gets caught trying to finish a piece it can't quite resolve, but that explanation isn't settled, and it's better treated as a guess than a fact. What is clear is that these loops are very common, generally harmless, and more frequent when the mind isn't occupied. In the shower, on a walk, waiting for a page to load. People trade all sorts of tricks for getting rid of them. Playing the song through to the end, switching to another tune, taking up a small, absorbing task. Some of these seem to help some of the time, but none works reliably for everyone. An earworm often fades with time, or after attention has shifted elsewhere. What the whole thing reveals is that memory isn't only something you reach for on purpose. Music can install itself and run in the background, uninvited, drawing on some of the same mental capacities that let you imagine music deliberately. And while one part of the mind loops a tune you're very aware of, another part can miss things you'd swear you couldn't, including changes happening right in front of you. Picture two photographs of the same street scene, shown one after another with a brief blank flashed between them. In the second photo, something sizable is different. A parked car has changed color, a railing has vanished, a building has gained a window. You'd expect the change to leap out. Often it doesn't. People can stare, flick back and forth, and still fail to find it. This is change blindness, a real difficulty in noticing even large changes to a scene when the change happens during some kind of disruption. A cut between shots, a blink, a flicker, a moment when you glance away. Any of these can hide an alteration that would be obvious if it unfolded smoothly in front of you. It's worth separating this from simply overlooking something you weren't expecting. This isn't a hidden object you never thought to look for. Here, you may be looking straight at the very thing that changes. The hard part is registering that it is now different from how it was a moment earlier, and that comparison across time is trickier than it feels. The reason lies in how vision handles a scene over time. We do take in and hold visual detail. The idea isn't that nothing is stored, but we don't keep a complete, photograph-perfect copy of every scene on hand for exact side-by-side matching. To catch a change, attention generally needs to be on the right part of the scene at the right moment, so the before and the after can be lined up. A disruption can make that comparison much harder, and the change slips past. You meet this outside any experiment. A film has a continuity slip, a glass full in one shot, half empty in the next, and most of the audience never notices. A friend changes something about their appearance, and you feel that something's different without being able to name it. Whether you catch it depends on where your attention was, what you expected to see, and how the change was masked. None of this means your eyes are betraying you. In ordinary viewing, when a change happens smoothly and in full view, the movement itself is a strong cue. You see the shift as it occurs, and it's hard to miss. Change blindness shows up mainly when that cue is removed, and the before and after are separated by an interruption. And there are qualities in a scene that vision doesn't merely track, but actively works out. Color is one of the clearest. Hold a white sheet of paper by a window at midday, then carry it into a room lit by a warm yellow bulb. Physically, the light bouncing off it has changed a great deal, yet the paper looks white in both places. Your visual system corrects for the lighting behind the scenes, so the page keeps a steady identity as you move around. This ability is called color constancy, and it points to something important about how color works. The color you see isn't simply painted onto an object, waiting to be read off, but it isn't only the raw light hitting your eye either. It's closer to an estimate. The visual system takes the light reflected from a surface, weighs it against the illumination around it and the colors nearby, and works out its best guess at the relatively stable properties of the surface itself. Most of the time, this estimate is so good you never catch it happening. A banana looks yellow at noon, at dusk, and under kitchen lights, even though the actual light reaching your eye differs each time. Your visual system holds the banana's color steady by discounting the lighting, a genuinely hard calculation performed effortlessly and constantly. But the process can be led astray. When the lighting in a scene is ambiguous and there aren't enough cues to pin down what kind of light is falling on a surface, different people's visual systems can settle on different answers. A few years ago, a single photograph of a dress did exactly this. People split into camps, each sincerely seeing different colors, and each a little baffled that anyone saw otherwise. Various explanations have been offered, usually about the assumptions people make regarding the light in the photo. Though it's fair to say no single account has completely closed the case. This is subtler than it first sounds. Color perception is systematic and highly useful, not arbitrary. It helps you recognize objects across changing conditions all day long. But perceived color depends on more than the pattern of light reaching your eye. It also takes in the illumination and the surrounding context, the visual system's read on the light in the room. And that willingness to fold context into perception isn't limited to color. It reaches across the senses, including the surprising way that what you see can change what you hear. When you talk with someone face to face, you probably assume you're listening with your ears alone, but you're also reading their mouth. Watching lips move is such a natural part of understanding speech that you do it continuously, and mostly you never notice how much it shapes what you hear. There's a well-known demonstration of this. A person is filmed saying one simple syllable, while the soundtrack is swapped for a different one. When people watch and listen at the same time, many report hearing a third sound, not quite the one that was spoken, not quite the one that was played, but a blend the brain settles on by combining the two. This is the McGurk effect, and it shows that hearing speech isn't purely about sound. Your sense of what someone said is drawn from both what you hear and what you see their mouth doing. When the two agree, which is nearly always, visual information can make speech easier to understand, especially when the sound is unclear, helping you follow words in a noisy room. When they're deliberately mismatched, you can notice the join. It's worth being precise here. Vision doesn't just overrule hearing. The two are combined, and which one carries more weight shifts with the circumstances. The effect also isn't the same for everyone. It varies from person to person, across languages, with the particular sounds used, and with conditions like how clearly you can see the face. Some people experience it strongly, others barely, and not everyone arrives at the same blended sound. You feel the useful version of this whenever hearing is hard. In a loud cafe, watching someone's lips makes their words markedly easier to catch. On a video call, when the sound drifts out of sync with the picture, speech starts to feel oddly effortful because the usual match between moving mouth and arriving sound has come apart. What all this reveals is that the senses aren't separate channels reporting on their own. Hearing and vision are woven together into a single impression of what was said, so seamlessly that you only notice the weave when an experiment tugs at it. And if a perception can be shaped this way in a single moment, then a memory, formed and reshaped over far longer stretches of time, has even more room to change. Think of a memory you feel sure about, a birthday, a trip, an ordinary afternoon from years ago. It feels solid, like a recording you could play back on demand. But memory doesn't work much like playback. Remembering is reconstructive rather than a literal replay, and details can sometimes shift through later information, inference, and retelling. Most of the time, this is harmless, and most of what you remember is broadly accurate. But it opens the door to something curious. Memories can absorb information that was never part of the original event. Researchers call one version of this the misinformation effect. After you experience something, a misleading detail introduced afterward, through a leading question, a later conversation, a photograph, or your own repeated imagining, can work its way in until you can't tell it apart from what actually happened. Take a small, ordinary case. You and a friend both remember a dinner you shared, but you picture a candle on the table, and they insist there wasn't one. The difference may have come from a later suggestion, an assumption about the scene, or ordinary reconstruction. Neither of you is lying. The two memories have simply grown apart over time. It's important not to overstate this. Ordinary memories bending at the edges is very different from the much bolder idea that whole, richly detailed events can easily be planted in anyone's mind. Under certain conditions, some people have come to remember things that didn't occur, but this is neither effortless nor guaranteed, and it doesn't mean a mistaken memory is invented from nothing. An inaccurate memory can still preserve much of the original event while containing altered or misplaced details. None of this makes memory unreliable in some sweeping way. Memory often preserves the meaning and gist of what matters more reliably than it preserves exact detail. It keeps the shape of an experience and fills in the specifics as needed, which is why feeling certain about a memory and being correct about it aren't quite the same thing. Which leaves one question waiting. If a memory can take on new details each time you return to it, then what is actually happening in that act of remembering? The moment you reach back and, in reaching, quietly change what you find. A memory can feel like an object in storage, sealed, finished, waiting on a shelf until you take it down to look at it. But taking it down may not leave it untouched. There's growing evidence that the act of recalling something can, under the right conditions, briefly open that memory up and make it changeable again. This idea is called reconsolidation. When a memory first forms, it goes through a period of settling, consolidation, during which it becomes more stable and durable. Reconsolidation suggests that pulling a stored memory back into an active state, reactivating it, can return it for a limited window to a more flexible condition. During that window, the memory can be modified. Then it restabilizes and settles again, sometimes carrying whatever shifted while it was open. It helps to set this beside the sort of memory error that comes from suggestion and misleading information. That described the observable ways in which later information can change what you recall. Reconsolidation is a different level of claim, a proposed biological process by which a reactivated memory may, under certain conditions, enter a temporarily modifiable state before settling once more. The two aren't rivals. New information may be part of what gets taken in while a memory is reactivated. What's proposed here is the underlying process that could allow that to happen. A few cautions matter. This doesn't mean that every time you remember something you overwrite it, or that recall wipes the old version and prints a new one. Memories are not erased and swapped out wholesale each time they surface. The effect appears under particular conditions, not universally, and much of the strongest mechanistic evidence comes from tightly controlled laboratory work, a good deal of it in animals. Ordinary human memory is richer and messier, and it hasn't been shown that everyday autobiographical memories become biologically editable every time they come to mind. How far these findings reach is still being worked out. Even so, the broad picture is striking. A memory may be less like a photo in a drawer and more like a document that has to be opened to be read. Revisiting it often may firm up some parts, while under the right conditions, leaving others open to small updates. Which raises a question about the memories we return to across a whole lifetime, and why certain stretches of the past stay so much brighter than others. Ask an older person to name the songs that matter most to them, and a striking number will come from one slice of life, roughly the teens and 20s. The same holds for the books that shaped them, the friendships that felt most vivid, the events they reach for when they tell you who they are. Later decades fill in the rest, but that early window seems to shine. Researchers call this pattern the reminiscence bump. When older adults are asked to recall memories from across their whole lives, they tend to produce more from adolescence and early adulthood than chance would predict, a rise in an otherwise uneven landscape. The exact ages aren't fixed. They vary from person to person and study to study, but the general shape turns up again and again. Why it happens isn't settled, and several explanations may work together rather than compete. One points to novelty. Those years are crowded with first times, first love, first job, leaving home, an early taste of real independence, and novel or transitional experiences may draw more attention, more retelling, and more personal meaning than routine ones that repeat, which can leave them easier to reach for later. Another points to identity. Adolescence and early adulthood are when many people work out who they are, and memories bound up with that self-defining work may be held onto more firmly. A third is cultural. Societies carry a rough, expected timeline, with milestones like finishing school, starting work, and forming relationships clustering in the same span, which gives those years added structure and weight. None of this means childhood or middle age is a void. Plenty is remembered from every part of a life, and early childhood follows its own patterns. The bump is about relative density, a stretch that yields more vivid, more reachable memories than the years on either side. There's something worth sitting with there. The music you loved at 17 may feel permanently louder than anything since, not because it was better, but because of when it landed. Those years become a kind of home base the memory keeps returning to, and when it returns, it seldom arrives as a neutral report. The past tends to come back colored by how it feels. A camping trip that was cold, cramped, and rained out somehow becomes, a year later, one of your fonder memories. The traffic and the sunburn recede. What stays is the fire on the last night and the laughing. Look back far enough at almost any rough patch, and it often softens into something you're oddly glad you lived through. Two related tendencies sit underneath that. The first is a broad lean toward remembering past experiences a little more warmly than we rated them at the time, a mild upgrading in how the past feels overall. The second is more specific. For many everyday memories, the negative feelings attached to an event seem to lose their intensity faster than the positive ones do. The remembered outline of an event may remain recognizable even while the emotion attached to it changes. That feeling is what shifts, and it tends to shift in a favorable direction. The reach of this needs care. It describes a general pattern across ordinary memories, not a rule that every painful experience turns pleasant. Some memories hold their sting for a very long time, and this is not a claim about the heaviest things a person carries. What the tendency captures is milder, the everyday irritations, embarrassments, and letdowns that lose their edge over time, so that on balance, the remembered past can feel warmer than the present moment does. This is part of what fuels nostalgia. When an earlier time tugs at you with fondness, some of that pull comes from this uneven fading, the good notes lingering while the sour ones grow faint. For some people, nostalgia can feel connecting or meaningful, though it is neither automatically accurate nor automatically beneficial. Notice, though, what has and hasn't moved. The past itself is fixed. The events are what they were. What changes is the emotional tone you feel on revisiting them and the verdict you reach looking back. That distance between living something and later judging it appears in another form too, in how we score an entire experience once it's finished. Two people leave the same long museum. One spent 3 hours inside, the other barely 90 minutes. Yet when they compare notes on the way out, their overall verdicts land close together. What seems to shape each judgment isn't the total time so much as a couple of standout moments, a favorite room, and the way the visit wrapped up. This reflects a well-documented tendency in how people sum up past experiences. When we look back and give something a single overall rating, good or bad, worth it or not, we lean heavily on 2 points: the most intense moment, often called the peak, and how the experience ended. It's known as the peak-end rule. It doesn't govern every memory, and it emerges most clearly in this kind of after-the-fact, all-things-considered verdict. But there, the peak and the ending carry outsized weight. Running alongside it is a second pattern. The sheer length of an experience often matters far less to the final judgment than you'd expect, sometimes called duration neglect. A shorter episode and a much longer one can end up rated about the same because the judgment leans on those key moments rather than on the clock. This is context-dependent and clearest in controlled comparisons, so it's better held as a strong leaning than a firm law. You can feel it in familiar situations. A dinner that was pleasant all evening but ended in a tense dispute over the bill gets filed under disappointment. A long, tiring drive is recalled well because the final hour was lovely. A film can be made or unmade by its closing scene. Whatever sits near the end tends to speak loudest afterward. What this really pulls apart is 2 things we usually treat as one. There is the experience as it unfolds, moment by moment, and there is the experience as you judge it later, tilted toward a peak and an ending, standing in for the whole. The score you give something afterward is not a plain average of how it actually felt from the inside, and sometimes the gap runs the other way, long stretches of life that leave almost nothing to judge at all, because while they were happening, your attention was somewhere else entirely. You arrive home, park, and realize you can't recall a single thing about the drive, not the turns, not the lights, not the other cars. You completed the familiar route, yet very few details of it remain. It was so familiar that you ran it while your thoughts were miles away. This is automaticity at work. When an action is practiced enough, it can run with very little conscious monitoring, freeing your attention to wander off toward plans, worries, or nothing in particular. The behavior carries on while your awareness is elsewhere. The driving version even has an informal nickname, highway hypnosis, though that phrase is a loose label, not a precise medical condition or a single, well-defined brain state. It just names the familiar feeling of arriving with the journey missing. It's worth being clear about what this is and isn't. Automatic doesn't mean asleep. In the ordinary version, you're awake and responsive. Well-practiced actions can carry on with reduced conscious monitoring, but that same reduced monitoring can make an unexpected event easier to miss or slower to react to. This is not the same as real drowsiness or fatigue. Drowsiness is a different condition, though it can overlap with inattention, and it is dangerous. The point here is routine competence with the mind roaming, not nodding off. You'll recognize the same thing far from any road. You brush your teeth while planning the day and couldn't say afterward which side you began on. You type a long familiar password fluently but can't recite it slowly. You make your morning coffee on autopilot, every step in place, none of it remembered. That last detail, none of it remembered, is the revealing part. Rich, lasting memories of an event tend to require attention while it happens. When attention is off wandering, fewer details may be encoded into lasting, episodic memory, which is why whole routine stretches can leave so little trace behind. The task gets done. The experience of doing it just doesn't stay with you. But a wandering mind isn't always free to roam wherever it pleases. Sometimes it circles back, over and over, to the one thought you were trying hardest to leave behind. Told firmly not to think about a white bear, many people notice that the bear appears almost at once and may keep returning as they try to push it away. The very effort to banish a thought can be what keeps it present. This is sometimes called an ironic effect, and the reasoning behind it is oddly elegant. To make sure you're not thinking about something, part of the mind has to keep watch for it, checking, in effect, whether the forbidden thought has appeared. But that monitoring means holding the thought in mind as the thing to avoid, So the act of suppression plants a small, persistent reminder of exactly what you're trying to forget. The examples are usually harmless. You resolve not to hum an annoying tune, and it plays all afternoon. You tell yourself not to raise a sensitive subject, and it presses at the front of your thoughts. You try to stop dwelling on a slightly embarrassing thing you said, and it keeps coming back. In each case, the effort not to think seems to keep the thought within reach. It's important not to overstate this. Not every attempt at suppression backfires, and plenty of unwanted thoughts do fade when you turn away from them. The rebound seems more likely under particular conditions, when you're tired, stressed, loaded with other tasks, or trying to hold the suppression up for a long stretch. When you have mental capacity to spare, the watching tends to stay in the background. When the mind is stretched thin, cognitive load may make the monitored thought more accessible, so it surfaces more readily, though this is a tendency, not a single guaranteed process. This is different from a mind that simply strays on its own. Here, nothing is roaming freely. You are actively trying to steer away from one specific thing, and the steering itself keeps that thing in view. Control and intrusion turn out to be closely linked. What it reveals is a small paradox in how attention and intention fit together. Willing yourself not to notice something requires, at some level, noticing it. This doesn't mean that shifting attention always solves the problem. It shows that suppression becomes especially difficult when attention stays organized around the very thought being avoided. And attention, once occupied, can be steered in subtler ways too, sometimes by nothing more than a number that happened to arrive first. At a market stall, the seller names a high opening price. You know it's inflated, yet your counteroffer comes out higher than it would have if they'd started low. The first figure on the table has shaped the whole negotiation without either of you quite deciding it should. This tendency to lean toward an initial value is called anchoring. When people estimate something uncertain, a price, a distance, a quantity, a date, an early reference point tends to tug the final answer in its direction. Presented with a high starting number, estimates come out higher, with a low one, lower. The anchor sets a mental starting place, and judgments gather around it. One well-known account is that people adjust away from the anchor, but usually stop too soon, ending up closer to it than they should. This idea, insufficient adjustment, is influential, though it's best treated as one explanation among several rather than the final word. What's clearer is the overall pattern. Reference points matter, often more than we notice. Even so, anchoring isn't a lever where any number seizes control of a decision. The effect depends on the situation, how uncertain you are, how relevant the anchor seems, how much you already know about the thing being judged. Relevance can affect the strength of an anchor, but even an arbitrary number can influence an estimate under some conditions. Relevant knowledge and clearer information can sometimes reduce the effect, although expertise does not guarantee immunity. Anchors are everywhere once you look. A crossed-out original price makes the new price feel like a bargain. A suggested donation amount nudges what people give. An asking price frames every offer that follows. Even a rough first guess at how many people were in a room can color your later estimate. What this says about judgment is quietly humbling. We like to think our estimates come from weighing the evidence cleanly, but the order in which information arrives leaves a mark. Where we begin tends to color where we end up, and it isn't only opening numbers that tilt our sense of what's true. Sometimes it's simply how readily an example comes to mind. After a friend's flight is delayed for hours, air travel starts to feel unreliable, even though your own trips have mostly gone smoothly. One vivid, easily recalled case outweighs a long run of forgettable on-time journeys. This is the availability heuristic. When judging how common or likely something is, people often lean on how easily examples come to mind. If instances arrive quickly, the thing feels frequent. If nothing surfaces, it feels rare. It's a fast, usually helpful shortcut, but ease of recall and actual frequency are not the same, and they can come apart. Several things make an example easy to summon that have little to do with how often it truly happens. Recency is one. A story you heard this morning is more available than one from years ago. Vividness is another. A dramatic or unusual event stands out, while ordinary ones blur together. So the memorable cases loom large in your sense of the odds, and the unremarkable majority, precisely because it's unremarkable, drops out of the count. The everyday versions are easy to spot. A single tense encounter with a bold, territorial goose can make the local park feel newly hazardous. Hearing three friends mention the same minor car trouble can convince you the model is unreliable, even if most owners have no complaints at all. A run of stories about one topic can make it seem like that's all that's happening anywhere. It's worth being careful here. This doesn't mean vivid coverage always distorts judgment, or that people are helpless before whatever they heard last. Ease of retrieval is one cue among many. We also draw on what we know, which sources we trust, and how well an example seems to fit. The shortcut is a starting point, not the whole calculation. Still, it shapes more of our sense of frequency than we tend to admit. Ease of recall can function as a rough cue for how often something happens, a useful shortcut that sometimes leads judgment away from the actual frequency. And what comes to mind isn't only a matter of counting. Some things press on us not because they're likely, but because of how much it would cost to lose them. Finding a 20 in an old coat pocket is a nice little lift. For many people, losing a 20 can feel more consequential than unexpectedly finding the same amount feels rewarding. The amounts match, but the emotional responses may not. That imbalance points to loss aversion. In many decisions, the prospect of a loss seems to carry more psychological force than the prospect of an equivalent gain. Avoiding a setback can matter more to us than achieving a benefit of the same size. In some decisions, this can contribute to a reluctance to give up a position we already hold. A close relative is the endowment effect. Once something feels like yours, you may value it more highly than you did before it was yours. Give someone a plain mug and ask what they'd sell it for, and the figure they name often exceeds what they'd have paid to buy the very same mug minutes earlier. Possession seems to lift an object's worth in the owner's eyes. The two ideas are linked but distinct. Loss aversion is the broad tendency for the sting of losing to outweigh the pleasure of gaining. The endowment effect is narrower. It's about ownership itself raising perceived value. One influential explanation links this to loss aversion, since giving up an owned object may be experienced as a loss, though that account isn't the only one and isn't fully settled. Both show up in small moments. You keep a jacket you never wear because letting it go feels like surrendering something. You're reluctant to trade your usual seat, your familiar desk, or your current phone plan, even for an arguably better option, because switching means parting with what you already hold. A couple of cautions belong here. There's no fixed, universal ratio by which losses outweigh gains, and these tendencies don't appear identically in every person, culture, or situation. They're influential patterns, not iron maws. Context, framing, and what's at stake all change how strongly they show. What they share is a lean toward holding on, a subtle asymmetry in how we value keeping versus getting. And when we do hold on, or finally let go, we're seldom short of reasons. The curious part is where those reasons actually come from. In a simple experiment, people choose which of two faces they find more attractive. Then, through a bit of sleight of hand, they're handed the face they didn't pick and asked to explain their choice. A fair number don't notice the swap at all and go on to describe in confident detail why they preferred the very option they had actually rejected. This is called choice blindness. Under certain conditions, people can fail to detect that the outcome in front of them isn't the one they selected, and when asked why they chose it, some will readily offer reasons for a decision they never made. It's worth stating plainly what this does and doesn't show. It doesn't mean people never know their own minds or can't tell what they picked. Often the switch is caught right away. The effect appears in some cases, not all, and how often it goes undetected varies with the task, how different the options are, and how the substitution is presented. But that it happens at all is telling. What it suggests is that explaining a choice can be partly separate from making it. We tend to assume our reasons come first and the choice follows from them. Sometimes the order runs the other way. The outcome is already there, and the mind supplies a fitting justification after the fact, sincerely and fluently. The explanation feels like the true account of the decision, even when it was built to match a result that wasn't chosen. The examples used here are deliberately low stakes. 2 photographs, 2 flavors of jam, 2 everyday products. No one's deepest values are on the line, and that's rather the point. Even in small, honest choices, the story we tell about ourselves can be looser than it feels from the inside. None of this makes preferences fake or the self an illusion. People have real tastes and real reasons. It simply shows that self-explanation isn't a perfect readout of what moved us, that we sometimes assemble a plausible account rather than report a fixed one. And once such an account is in place, it tends to gather support. Attention has a way of favoring whatever fits the story we've already arrived at. Having settled on a new phone, you go online to read about it, and somehow the glowing reviews catch your eye while the critical ones slide past. You come away more certain than ever that you chose well. The information was mixed, your attention wasn't. This leaning is called confirmation bias. Once a belief or expectation is in place, it tends to shape what we look for, what we notice, what we remember, and how we read anything ambiguous. We don't usually set out to ignore the other side. It's quieter than that. Agreeable information feels more relevant and more convincing, easier to take in, while inconvenient information gets a harder look or a quicker dismissal. Notice that this is different from how readily examples surface in memory. That was about availability. This is about a slant in how we gather and weigh evidence around something we already think. The two can work together, but they aren't the same. The everyday forms are mild. A fan watching their team sees the referee's close calls as unfair to their side and fair against the other. Two friends leave the same film convinced it proves opposite points, each having latched onto the scenes that fit. You read a short, blank message from someone and, depending on your mood, find it either warm or cold. The words didn't change, your expectation did. The pattern can be shaped by several things at once: how strongly we already believe something, how motivated we are to reach a particular conclusion, how ambiguous the evidence is, what we're really trying to work out, and what we happen to know about the topic. And knowledge and reasoning ability don't automatically remove the bias. Under some conditions, they can even provide more ways to defend a conclusion someone already prefers. What this reveals is that belief isn't a neutral container we pour facts into. It behaves more like a lens that bends incoming light toward what it expects to see. Most of the time, we feel we're simply following the evidence, when our interpretation of the evidence is partly following our expectations. And beliefs aren't the only thing that passes between people and colors a room. Sometimes what spreads isn't an idea at all, but a feeling. Walk into a meeting where something has just gone wrong, and you feel it before anyone explains. A tightness in the room, shoulders set, voices clipped. Within a minute, your own mood has shifted to match, though no one told you what happened. This is emotional contagion, the tendency for feelings to pass between people, so that one person's state can nudge the states of those around them. It happens through many small channels at once: a face's expression, the tone and pace of a voice, posture, where people are looking, the shared situation everyone is reading together. We pick up these signals continuously, often below the level of deliberate thought, and they tilt how we feel. Part of the story is that people tend to mirror what they see, a slight tensing when others are tense, and easing when others relax, and that bodily alignment may sometimes contribute to a shift in emotion. But automatic mirroring is only one piece. Shared attention, the meaning of the situation, and the back and forth of interaction all matter too. No single channel fully accounts for it. The everyday versions are familiar. Sit with a genuinely relaxed friend and your own edges soften. One person laughing can set off a whole room long after anyone remembers the joke. A household where someone is on edge can grow tense all evening, each person picking up a little of it from the others. It's worth separating this from truly understanding how someone feels. Emotional contagion can happen without your reasoning through why the other person feels as they do. Your mood can shift toward theirs without your grasping the cause or even registering that it's happened. Consciously imagining another's experience is a slower, more effortful thing, layered on top. None of this means every nearby feeling soaks into you, or that moods move like something you catch when you're unwell. People differ in how much they take on, and context shapes how far a feeling travels. But the general pull is real. We are permeable to one another, tuned to the emotional weather of the people we're with. And the more time we spend with the same people, places, and things, something else begins to happen. Familiarity itself starts to change how we feel about them. A song comes on that you didn't care for the first time you heard it, but it's been playing everywhere for weeks, and now, almost against your will, you find yourself enjoying it. Nothing about the song changed. What changed is that it became familiar. This is the mere exposure effect, the finding that simply encountering something repeatedly can, under the right conditions, make us like it more. It works best when the thing started out neutral or mildly pleasant. A face seen a few times feels friendlier. A logo glimpsed often may begin to feel more familiar and sometimes slightly more appealing. A route you've walked many times feels more comfortable than an unfamiliar one, even when it's no better. One influential explanation is that familiar things are processed more fluently. Something met before tends to be handled a little more smoothly the next time, and that ease can feel faintly pleasant, a comfort we may misread as liking the thing itself. This fluency account isn't the only proposal, but familiarity does seem able to borrow the glow of preference. But repetition doesn't reliably increase liking, and that's worth stating clearly. If a first impression was negative, more exposure can deepen the dislike rather than ease it. Too much repetition breeds boredom, and a once pleasant song played to death turns grating. And if people sense they're being shown something on purpose, the effect can weaken or reverse. Familiarity is a gentle nudge, not a guarantee. It also helps to keep familiarity separate from quality. The fact that something feels comfortable because you've met it often says little about whether it's actually any good. A well-worn habit, a default choice, a long-seen brand can feel right through sheer repetition, while a better but unfamiliar option feels vaguely wrong at first. And this is only a nudge. Familiarity alone doesn't explain trust, friendship, or the large choices of a life, which draw on far more. What it does is tilt the low-level sense of ease we feel toward whatever we already know. That same tilt appears when we turn from things to people and begin explaining why others act the way they do. The driver who cuts in front of you is reckless and rude. When you do something similar an hour later, you were only trying to make a light you couldn't afford to miss. Same maneuver, two very different explanations. One about character, one about circumstance. This tendency has a name. The fundamental attribution error, sometimes called correspondence bias. When we explain other people's behavior, we lean toward their personality. They're impatient, careless, cold, and we underweight the situation they were in. The pressures, constraints, and bad days that might account for their actions are hard to see from the outside, so we reach for a trait instead. The examples are ordinary. A cashier moving slowly seems lazy when the till may be jammed or the last customer may have left chaos behind. A colleague who's late looks unreliable, though the traffic or the childcare emergency stays invisible to you. A guest who's quiet at dinner reads as aloof when they might just be exhausted or shy in a room of strangers. Someone who doesn't reply to a message seems dismissive, though their day may have swallowed it whole. A few cautions matter. This isn't a fixed law of human nature. Its strength varies, and research suggests it can differ across cultures, appearing more readily in some settings than in others. And it certainly doesn't mean personality is a myth. People really do have stable traits that shape what they do. The claim is narrower. From the outside, we tend to overweight the person and underweight the situation. It's tempting to reduce this to judging others harshly and ourselves kindly. There's something to that. We can see our own circumstances from the inside. But the picture is more tangled than a clean split between how we explain ourselves and how we explain everyone else. And that meat contrast has real limits. One contributor is an imbalance in what information is available. Another person's behavior is visible, while many of the pressures surrounding it are not. So the person can loom larger than the situation. But that isn't the whole story. Even when some situational pressures are known, people may still draw conclusions about character. The account behind a stranger's behavior is usually more than we can see. Yet even without that account, we stay finely attuned to the people around us, often matching them without meaning to. Partway through a conversation, you cross your legs, and a moment later, so does the person across from you. Neither of you planned it. Perhaps neither of you noticed. This kind of echoing runs through much of how people interact. It's often called unconscious mimicry or behavioral mirroring. The way we sometimes take on another person's posture, gestures, expressions, or speech patterns without meaning to. You might match someone's speaking pace, lean in when they lean in, pick up a phrase they keep using, or smile a beat after they smile. It tends to happen on its own, outside deliberate control. The examples are easy to catch once you start looking. Two people in an easy conversation often settle into similar postures. Speaking pace and phrasing can begin to align during a long conversation. A friend's favorite turn of phrase turns up in your own speech a week later. These small alignments thread through ordinary interaction. Still, a few things are worth keeping straight. It isn't the case that everyone mirrors everyone all the time. How much it happens depends on the people, the relationship, how much attention is on the interaction, and individual differences. Some people mirror more, some settings invite it less. Mimicry can be dialed down or simply absent. It isn't a constant background hum. It's also often said that mimicry builds rapport, that mirroring makes people warm to one another. There's something to this, but it's context-dependent, not automatic. Mirroring doesn't reliably produce trust, liking, or cooperation, and its effects shift with the situation. And it certainly isn't proof of affection. Seeing someone match your posture doesn't mean they like you. It may mean very little at all. What the pattern suggests is more modest than a single purpose. Small forms of alignment can arise without a deliberate decision, and in some settings they may accompany a smoother interaction. It needn't mean anything more than that. And yet, for all this quiet mirroring of one another, we don't weigh every signal evenly. Negative signals, a sharp word or a poor first impression, can receive disproportionate attention and remain especially memorable. You give a talk that goes well. Afterward, 10 people offer warm praise, and one person mentions a slide that fell flat. Hours later, walking home, it's the single criticism you're turning over, not the 10 kind words. That imbalance is one face of what psychologists call negativity bias. Across many situations, negative things, a critical remark, a small failure, an unpleasant encounter, can carry more force than equally sized positive ones. They tend to catch attention faster, feel more pressing, and stay active in the mind longer. It's better to think of this as a broad family of findings than a single rule. Negative information often draws the eye more quickly. It can weigh more heavily when we form impressions or reach a judgment. It sometimes lingers after comparable good news has already faded. These are related tendencies, not one tidy mechanism, and they don't all appear every time. The everyday shapes are easy to recognize. One awkward moment can seem to define an otherwise lovely evening. A single sharp email overshadows a morning of pleasant ones. Meet someone who makes a poor first impression, and it may take a good deal of later warmth to soften it, while a strong first impression is more easily dented. Notice one problem in a day where everything else went right, and that's often the part you end up describing at dinner. People sometimes explain this by pointing to our distant past, arguing that noticing what could harm us mattered more than savoring what merely pleased us. It's a reasonable idea, and it may hold part of the answer, but it's best treated as one plausible account rather than an established fact. What's clearer is the pattern itself, which turns up reliably enough to shape how we read our days. None of this means the bad always wins, or that every hard moment outlasts every good one. Positive experiences gather too, and much of a contented life is built from them. It simply means the scales aren't perfectly even. A little extra weight rests on the darker side, tilting attention and memory before we've consciously decided anything. And not every lingering impression comes from something unpleasant. Sometimes what stays with us is a faint sense of familiarity, arriving from nowhere, attached to a moment that ought to feel entirely new. You step into a room you've never entered, and for a second or two it feels deeply known, as though you've stood in this exact spot, in this light, hearing these words at some earlier time. You know you haven't, and yet the sense of having been here is vivid and briefly, completely convincing. This is déjà vu, a French phrase meaning already seen. It's the fleeting feeling that a present moment has happened before, even while you're fairly sure it hasn't, at least not in this precise way. It arrives without warning, lasts only a moment, and then loosens its hold as ordinary experience resumes. No single explanation is settled, and several approaches are still being explored. One idea is that déjà vu is a feeling of familiarity that surfaces without the memory it should belong to, a sense of recognition with nothing specific to recognize. Another points to a present scene resembling an earlier one you can't consciously recall, so the resemblance registers as familiarity without a traceable source. Others look to small differences in the timing of how a moment is taken in, or to a brief mismatch between the systems that handle knowing and remembering. These are possibilities, not conclusions. The examples tend to be ordinary. A sentence someone says feels like a line you've heard spoken before, in the same order, with the same pause. You round a corner in a new city, and the street seems oddly rehearsed. A conversation unfolds, and you half expect the next remark, as if following a script you never read. For most people, occasional déjà vu is common and harmless, a passing curiosity more than anything else. It's worth saying plainly what it isn't. It doesn't mean you're glimpsing the future, revisiting a past life, or catching sight of some other reality. The feeling is striking, but it points inward to the ordinary workings of recognition rather than outward to anything uncanny. What makes it linger in the mind is that it lets the unfamiliar feel briefly familiar, a crossing point we rarely get to notice. And there is another crossing we make every night, where the daytime world begins to loosen and release its hold. There is a place you pass through every night, though you rarely remember arriving there. It sits between waking and sleeping, a short transition where the ordinary rules of the mind start to loosen. If you've ever been falling asleep and seen shapes form behind your closed eyes, colors, a face that isn't quite a face, a staircase, a shoreline, a scene assembling out of nothing, then you've been there. Maybe you've heard your name in an empty room, or a single word with no sentence around it. Maybe you've felt yourself falling and woken with a small jolt. Some of these moments feel calm, others can feel odd or briefly startling. They are generally harmless, and most people experience some version of them. This transition has a name. It's called hypnagogia, the state of moving from waking into sleep. As you fall asleep, the systems that keep you alert and in control begin to ease off. Thought stops running in straight lines, images appear on their own, shift and dissolve, following no clear logic. It isn't dreaming yet, you're not fully asleep, and it's no longer ordinary waking thought either. It's a state in between, one the mind passes through on the way down into deeper sleep. Exactly how the brain generates these images is still being studied, so it's best understood as a loosening of waking control rather than a single, settled mechanism. Many people pass through it without remembering. Sometimes the images echo the day behind you. An activity repeated for hours can return here in fragments, rearranged. At other times, they seem to arrive from nowhere, surfacing from a part of the mind that grows more active once the rest goes still. For a short while before sleep takes over, the mind sets down its usual work. It stops sorting and planning. It lets loose images move across it without effort or aim, going wherever they go. Then, without your noticing the moment it happens, the transition deepens. The images grow longer and stranger. They begin to connect into scenes, and the scenes begin to tell their own stories. The edge of sleep gives way to sleep itself. Once sleep takes over, the night is far from idle. Beneath the stillness, some of the day's experiences are being worked on, not replayed for an audience, but steadily strengthened and settled, so that by morning they hold a little better than they did the night before. Sleep, it turns out, plays a real part in memory. Learning something doesn't finish the instant you stop practicing. A new memory is fragile at first, and the hours that follow, especially the hours of sleep, seem to help it stabilize so it becomes less easily lost. This is different from the first act of learning. It's more like the settling that comes afterward, when what you took in grows more durable. Rather than keeping every detail in equal measure, sleep appears to support some memories more than others. Salience, emotion, relevance, prior learning, and later cues may all influence what becomes more stable. But this selection is not perfect and not fully understood. Some experiences are strengthened, some are woven together with things you already knew, so a new fact finds a place among older ones, and many details fade, leaving only traces or broader patterns behind. You meet the results without ever seeing the work. A skill practiced in the evening, a passage of music, a movement, an unfamiliar route, can feel smoother the next morning, as if some rehearsal happened on its own. A subject studied before bed can feel steadier by daylight. A tangle of new information sometimes comes together overnight into something clearer. How all this happens isn't fully understood. Different stages of sleep seem to contribute in different ways, though the exact division of labor is still being studied, and it's easy to oversimplify. Dreaming often accompanies the night's activity, but it hasn't been shown that dreams are the means by which memory settles. What's reasonably clear is the broad shape of it. Sleep supports the slow consolidation of the day. And here, the explaining can rest. The room is dark. The day's noise has thinned to almost nothing. Somewhere beneath waking, the small, patient work continues, asking nothing of you, while beyond the window the hours turn and the night keeps its own unhurried time.